Yesterday, I introduced this phrase, a language of possibility. I said, as we think about behavior and advocacy and classroom management and relationships for children with disabilities, we wanted to develop a language of possibility. And we talked about child-centered approaches. We did that thought experiment on the difference between people-first language and more deficit-based models. And we thought about how language matters, how language so often shapes thinking, and then how thinking shapes behaviors. I want to return to that idea as we start things out this evening. And I want you to imagine these terms or mindsets: deficit, delay, disability. I want you to think about what comes to mind when we use this kind of language: deficit, delay, disability. I know for me, when I see, hear, read language like this, the emphasis is on what is lacking or broken or limited or an individual weakness. In our training this week, we've been really clear that we advocate for a different kind of language, a language that I would call of possibility, a language like we talked about last night that is child-centered. So here's another term to consider. Think about what comes to mind when you hear the term diversity. So I know for me, when I hear the term diversity, I have a very different emotional and cognitive register that happens, right? I see a classroom often because my background is in education. I see children and people from many different lived experiences and identities. I see, kind of like an image that's behind me today. This idea that many different types of people are coming together to form a community. And that's exactly what the neurodiversity movement is striving to do. So neurodiversity is the belief that differences and disabilities represent necessary and important variants in the human genome. So it's a belief that we need different kinds of minds and thinkers and leaders and artists and scholars, that the variance we see in how children and adults learn is not a deficit, but an asset. That diversity is what makes our classrooms and our communities richer, more humane, and more effective. In this final session, we're going to explore this a little more deeply. We're going to see how neurodiversity offers a strengths-based approach to disability, and that can inform how we raise, teach, and include children who live, learn, perceive, and think differently. We'll have some specific examples for what differentiation and the power of possibility can look like in our classrooms and communities. And I also want to talk a little bit about the impact of representation, how important it is for all of us to see and interact with people from our identity groups in a positive way. As we end this session, we'll also be ending the series, so I want to quickly recap where we've been throughout the week and set action goals for where we are going from here. Okay, neurodiversity. Neurodiversity, this research comes from Harvard Health. It was a 2021 paper by Balmer and Frere. Neurodiversity refers to the way that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. Neurodiversity says there's no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and that differences are not viewed as deficits. So neurodiversity refers to the diversity of all people. However, it's most often used in the context of autism spectrum disorder or other neurological or developmental conditions, such as ADHD. The neurodiversity movement began in the 1990s from a group of advocates that cut across many different fields, including teaching and learning and science and neuroscience and biology. And they were studying variance among different kinds of thinkers and realized and advocated that this is exactly what our world needs. I bring it up in this training because neurodiversity offers a strengths-based approach to disability, which has been the theme of our series this week. And that, of course, impacts the plans that we make to support kids and the ways that we cultivate inclusive classrooms. I shared that as we are exploring neurodiversity and differentiation tonight, I also want to explore representation. So we know, based on work in diversity, inclusion, and equity, that children need diverse curriculum. They need opportunities to both see themselves celebrated in the content and to see people whose lived experiences are different from them. In a lot of curriculum work, I think that we've made really positive advancements in having more diverse representation with race, with ethnicity, although we still have a long way to go. Even sometimes with religion, with culture, with language, again, we still have a long way to go. One area that I would love to see even more focus on is with respect to disability. So I would love in our classrooms and in our communities to see more individuals from the disability community celebrated in a really positive light. So tonight I'm going to share just 2 examples that have been meaningful to me in my own life and also to my students. Dr. Temple Grandin is a leading authority on autism. She's a member of the autism community and also on animal livestock behavior. The reason I bring up Dr. Grandin is because she is very open in public about crediting her autism as the reason she's been so successful in the sciences. She says that the way her brain is uniquely wired is what's given her the skill set and opportunity to think about livestock solutions from a new perspective. She talks often about how she thinks in pictures. She's widely published. She's a faculty member at Colorado State University. Time magazine has named her as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. She's a wonderful role model for all students. She's a wonderful affirming addition to your curriculum for girls in science and for people from the autism community. And so I'd like you to get to hear just a few minutes from Temple Grandin in her own words about her work related to autism, science, and advocacy.
You know, you never get cured of autism. But what you do is you learn better, is you learn more and more things.
Well, I didn't speak until I was 4. Now I have a BA and a master's, and I'm studying for my doctorate.
I can remember the frustration of not being able to talk. I couldn't get my words out. My speech came in gradually, a few words at a time. When I was a little kid, I was very autistic, nonverbal, rocking. You know, that's the kind of kid they just put away in the institution. But I had a speech teacher that worked really hard with me, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of young children getting early intervention. You got a 2-year-old or 3-year-old with no speech, don't wait. High school was absolutely worst part of my life. Teasing, teasing, teasing. I got kicked out of school for throwing a book at a girl, teased me because, you know, teasing really made my life miserable. And the only places I could get away from teasing was the specialized activities. Things like horseback riding, electronics lab, model rocket club. The line was drawn in the sand. I was not allowed to become a recluse in my room. I had to get out and do things. I'm always kind of baffled at just how illogical people are in their thinking. I'm very logical in my thinking, but when I was younger, I didn't know that other people thought more in words. You see, I think in pictures. If I don't have a picture, I don't think. And my mind is very, very associative. Being a visual thinker, I tend to put things into categories. You see, autism is a very big spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you got half the people at Silicon Valley. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got somebody who's very handicapped, remains nonverbal, is going to have to live in a supervised living situation. Really, really big spectrum. And you know, Einstein probably be labeled autistic today in a lot of school systems because he had no speech until age 3. I'm interested in seeing something that makes real change. I've done a lot of work that's made a lot of improvements in the livestock industry, and I think I've helped a lot of kids succeed. I want to see the kids that are like me succeed. That's the kind of stuff that makes me happy, when I see the things that I do make a difference.
In this very short speech by Temple Grandin, we can hear a lot of the themes from this week. So we can hear the importance of compassionate teachers who hold students to high expectations. We can hear about the importance of early intervention. We can hear the idea that disability can be a strength. We can also hear the importance of belonging. So I think as I listen to Temple Grandin and she talks about what a challenging and terrible time she had in high school, and I can just imagine, you know, were she in a different classroom community, a classroom community that took a different approach to bullying and diversity and belonging, how different and how much better that experience might have been. And it makes me so grateful that we're engaged in this conversation this week to try and create more inclusive classrooms and communities. I want to go over the concept of asynchrony briefly, because I think it relates to our strengths-based perspectives and to our work on neurodiversity. So asynchrony means uneven, right? So if a child has asynchronous development, it means that there is an uneven or a mismatch between different areas of functioning. So that could be cognitive, the way we think. It could be emotional, the way we feel, or it could be related to physical development. As you all know, I also have a background in gifted education, and we see asynchronous development a lot with gifted learners. For example, we might see a student who is a 3rd grader and reading at a 7th or 8th grade reading level, who throws temper tantrums like a 3-year-old, who is able to solve math above their age peers, and who has a really hard time making friends. With the profile of a student like that, you can see how their development is uneven, how there's a mismatch. You can also see how there are lots of different approaches a teacher might take to a student like that, right? So we could focus on their areas of challenge, and we certainly do want to support that. And we can focus on their areas of strength. So that reading that we talked about, the math that we talked about, we want to support whole children. And so that means looking at the whole child, the strengths and the challenges. I bring up giftedness and asynchrony tonight because I want us to, as we're thinking about creating inclusive classroom environments, I want us to also think about our gifted learners and our learners who are twice exceptional. So this might be another new term, twice exceptional, or you'll see it in the literature as the number 2 and the letter E, refers to students who have been identified as gifted and who have been identified with another diagnosis or disability. So this could be a gifted learner who has autism or a gifted learner who has ADHD. We are in recent years doing a much better job about learning more on the unique nature and needs of our twice exceptional learners. And I wanted to just plant this seed in your brain as you're working with students who learn differently and you're now really thinking about how can I pull out their strengths. I wanted you to know that there's this whole literature on children who are twice exceptional, who have two different kinds of exceptionalities, so that as we think about what support means, we can support holistically. I want to go over some specific strategies because I know as teachers, that's what we want. We want to know, this is all great. What can I do in my classroom tomorrow morning? So I want to think about differentiation. I shared that our theme kind of for tonight is neurodiversity, or even just diversity. Differentiation is the strategies that educators can use to respond to that difference or variance among the learners in their classrooms. One of the leading authorities on differentiation in the US is Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson. And she says, whenever a teacher reaches out to an individual student or a small group to vary their teaching in order to create a better learning experience, that teacher is differentiating instruction. So when you're in your classroom and you see that one student or a small group of students is responding differently to the content, and you go and you sit down with them and you try something different, that's differentiation. As we think about differentiation, there are 4 main domains that educators can differentiate in. So we can differentiate content, process, products, and the learning environment. So content, we can differentiate what the student needs to learn or how they will get access to the information. I think here about the importance of relationships. So when we know more about kids, for example, if we know that there's a student who loves basketball and we can bring basketball into the content as a hook for them, that can be a really powerful strategy to differentiate. We can differentiate process. So this is the activities in which a students engage in order to make sense of or master the content. When I was in high school, I had a very talented social studies teacher who let students either take their exams orally or written. He said he didn't care how we were expressing our knowledge of the content. He just wanted to know that we knew it. And so we had a large group of students who, rather than sitting to write for exams, would sign up to meet with him, and he would give them oral exams instead, where they could demonstrate their same mastery of the content, but they got to do so in a conversation. And those conversations were always super powerful. We can differentiate products. So those are those culminating projects that ask a student to rehearse, apply, or extend what they've learned in a unit. When I think about differentiating products, I think about how at the end of a unit, we often ask students to share what they've learned. And we can give choice, right? So we can say, you can give a speech, you can do a PowerPoint, you can put together a play, you can perform a song, you can write an essay. This is differentiating products. We can also differentiate the learning environment. So that's the way the classroom works and feels. We can set up different spaces in our learning environment to meet different needs. Here, I think about my friends in early elementary and the work that so many of them have done to set up quiet reading corners, to set up an art table in the back of the room, to set up these different spaces where students can continue engaging with content and learning, but can do so in ways that work for the ways their brains are uniquely wired, or just the way their day is going that day. Some days we all need to sit down at the art table and tear up and glue some things down. So these are the different ways we can differentiate. As we think about what this means for our practice, we can think about the 4 domains: content, process, products, and learning environment. And we're drawing on Dr. Tomlinson's work here. I want to go over some more specific differentiation strategies that cut across these 4 domains. Okay, as we think about writing support plans for students with disabilities, we often talk about 2 related terms. We talk about accommodations and we talk about modifications. This evening, I'm going to go over the differences between accommodations and modifications, though I'll share that's not nearly as important as the ways we create accommodations and modifications. I'm also going to share that you don't need specialized training in special education or disability to create powerful accommodations and modifications. This is something teachers and parents do every day. So accommodations change how students learn or how work is presented, but it does not change expectations or what students learn. So accommodations, you can remember, are focused on the how students learn, how work is presented to them. Over the next 2 slides, I'm going to share some common accommodations that we use in our school. So we might reduce the number of items or text on a page. For some students, it is overwhelming to see 20 questions or to see 3 paragraphs. And so instead of 3 paragraphs on 1 page, we might have 1 paragraph on 3 pages. We provide clear step-by-step written instructions. For some students, you can give them assignment directions to do a complex project that's multi-step, and off they go and they're just fine. For some students, you give an overview for a multi-step project and they sit there and they say, but teacher, what am I supposed to do? For students like that, we can break things down 1 step at a time. We can say, okay, first, what we want you to do is we want you to create your outline. Go and create your outline and then come back to me and I'll give you that next step. We're not changing what a student learns. We're just changing how we're presenting that material. Allowing oral responses instead of written responses, like my beloved social teacher did for us in high school. This is an accommodation if we're not assessing writing. If all we care about is content knowledge, then we're not changing what students learn here. Dictating answers to a scribe. I have a number of students who struggle to move from brain to paper. But if they can just move from brain to telling me, and I can write down exactly what they're telling me, they're able to demonstrate what they know far better. Again, this isn't changing what students learn, only how they're showing us what they learn. I personally am a horrible speller. The advent of spell check has been wonderful for me. So I have a strength in writing, but I'm not very strong in spelling. And so having spell check means that when I turn in a paper or a chapter and everything is spelled correctly, it's received in a far better way than if I didn't have spell check and I turned in that same paper with lots of spelling errors. Again, we're not changing what I know in that paper. We're just giving me a support. I'm not graded on spelling anymore as an adult. We can provide a computer when that's a resource that's available in our school to help students type out notes. I have lots of students who struggle to write in a straight line, sometimes even if we give them lined or graph paper. If we're not assessing math facts, we can allow students to have a calculator. We can take students to a quieter environment for testing. We can take students by themselves or in small groups for testing. We can give the same exam, but give it over multiple days so students only interact with half the material on day 1 and another half on day 2. We can give longer to complete assignments or assessments. Instead of 1 hour for an exam, you can have 2. We can allow breaks. It's powerful to be able to get up and take a walk around the school or get a drink of water and return to an assignment. We can provide help organizing assignments or deadlines. So those students that I talked about, when you give them a multi-step assignment and they look at you and they say, but teacher, what am I supposed to do? These are often the same students who don't know how to organize all of their assignments in their planner yet. And so we can start to give them strategies to get things organized while still holding them to the very same expectations that we're holding all students. So remember, accommodations change the how, but not the what. As we move into modifications, modifications change both the how and the what. So you can think about this as moving from smaller changes with accommodations to larger changes with modifications. We also use modifications all the time in our everyday life as parents and teachers. Here are some common modifications that we use in our school. Completing fewer assignments than their peers. So we can choose the key assignments and say, for this student, I really need to see these 3 things, not these 6. Completing different assignments than their peers. So this could be maybe when you are assessing writing, you allow a student to give a speech instead so that you can still see what they learned, but you can't assess all of the same skills. Working on different but related skills. I've shared a lot of stories this week about students I've worked with who had more moderate or profound disabilities and were mainstreamed with their general education peers. Sometimes in these situations, my students would be engaged in related but different content than the folks they were sitting with at the very same table. So for example, if we're doing research on bats, one group might be doing independent research where they're looking up information on a computer or a book. Another student might have a fact sheet that the teacher's already prepared about bats, and they're working through that sheet. And still another student might be working on a drawing of a bat and writing down 3 things she knows about bats. So we're all engaged in work about bats as a mammal in a science unit, but we're doing so in ways that are developmentally appropriate for the different needs of our learners. Writing shorter papers or assignments. So maybe we have assigned a 5-paragraph essay and we have a student who's still working on writing 1 really good paragraph. And so we decide as teachers, it would be better for that student to do 1 awesome paragraph than to struggle through the 5-paragraph essay. Completing an alternative assignment or project. So that's similar to what we just talked about with the bats, responding orally rather than in writing. This is a modification if you wanted to assess writing. So if one of the skills you were looking at is writing, but we need to let a student respond orally, that's okay. We know we can't assess writing there, but we can still assess content knowledge. Using a calculator or a table when we are assessing math facts. This is a modification because here we wanted to assess math facts, but we're going to provide extra supports for students who may need those. Having fewer options on a multiple choice exam. So let's say that normally there are 4 choices on a multiple choice exam, A, B, C, D. We may have students that aren't there yet. And so we give them a multiple choice exam with 2 or 3 options instead, and we find they experience a lot more success. With this modification, as with all modifications, we want to move along that continuum to go back, if possible, to accommodations, and then to go to just the regular differentiation we see in our classroom. So I know test anxiety is something we talked about yesterday. It could be that you are working with students who have such severe test anxiety right now. We shared some resources yesterday, that you want to start with a modification like this. Okay, instead of looking at 4 examples, A, B, C, D on an exam, we're going to try just 3, A, B, C. And we're going to try some of those strategies to reduce test anxiety, to build up confidence. And as we get stronger and better at tackling those exams, we can go back up to the 4 choices, but maybe we're testing in a smaller group or a quieter environment, those accommodations from earlier. So we can see how this is a continuum that can scaffold support all throughout a student's life. Every night, this is by design, we have talked about focusing on strengths. We want to always start with what a child can do and build from the unique talents your students bring to the classroom. all students have talents and strengths. I met last night with a brand new teacher who took teacher education classes with me. She's a new math teacher in middle school, and she's working with a student with profound disabilities right now. And she came to me for some advice on how could she support the student and how could she get her the services that she needed. And I was so proud of her because she started the conversation by telling me all about the student's strengths. So she's a very strong multiplier. She said she has all of her multiplication facts memorized. She's also able to manipulate the numbers to divide. And then she came to me with the really specific challenge of she doesn't yet know how to break down word problems. So we talked about some reading support. But this brand new teacher started with strengths. Here's what the student can do well. And we talked about how to celebrate those. We want to help children connect with multiple peer groups. So we talked about that myth at the beginning of the week, that the myth is inclusion is only good for some people. If we're talking about inclusion for children with disabilities, maybe inclusion helps kids with disabilities, but does it really help all kids? Yes, it really helps all kids. We all gain knowledge and skills when we get to work in diverse groups. We want to make sure that our students are also connecting with multiple groups. If we think about our asynchronous learners, so remember that uneven balance, students need lots of different peer groups to find like peers, right? So a student who has asynchronous development may need one kind of group where she can talk about the really challenging book she's reading, and may need a whole nother kind of group, maybe with younger children, where she can begin to develop some of those friend-making skills. So we want to give our kids access to diverse groups, and that includes diversity in age and cognitive ability, in addition to lived experience and identity. This research comes from the National Association for Gifted Children. Another differentiation strategy that all of us language arts teachers love is bibliotherapy. So this is using books and literature to address wellness and mental health. If you want to read more about bibliotherapy, which is a topic of study in psychology, there are two kinds. There's developmental bibliotherapy, which is used in school, so that's the one we'll focus on. But then there's also clinical or therapeutic bibliotherapy, which is used in professional treatment programs. The big takeaway for us as educators is that representation matters. We want to audit our classroom materials to make sure that we are not only showing, but celebrating diverse populations. And so we've talked about many different types of populations, and the one we're focused on this week is how are members of the disability community included in our curriculum in positive ways. And to that end, I want to give one more example of representation. I'm going to share with you a story by Paralympic sprinter Teresina Guilherme. It's in her native Portuguese, but we have English subtitles. Teresina is the fastest woman Paralympic sprinter in the world. She is also blind. And so in the Paralympics, for our blind athletes, they run with a guide to help them along the course. She's so fast that it's very difficult to find a guide fast enough to run with her. This story is a few years old, but her most recent guide was Usain Bolt, who we know is our fastest sprinter in the world. And so he was partnered with her in her last races, but this is an older story. What I want you to read for as you get to hear her story is the power of possibility. So remember, we're focused on a language of possibility tonight, of high expectations and strengths-based approaches.
Meu nome é Terezinha Guilhermina e esta é a minha incrível história. O impacto do esporte na minha vida transformou a Terezinha Guilhermina em alguém que sonhava, na Terezinha Guilhermina que hoje realiza sonhos. A minha deficiência chama-se retinose pigmentar e é falta de célula de luminosidade na retina. Eu sempre tive perda superior a 95% da visão e hoje só tenho percepção de luz. Ela afeta em especial para sair quando eu trombo, quando eu tenho que sair sozinha, fazer alguma coisa sozinha, mas não me impede necessariamente de fazer nada do que eu queira. Durante a minha infância, o impacto que a minha condição financeira em especial teve na minha realidade, na minha maneira de ver o mundo, é que eu acredito que as pessoas que não têm nada nas mãos podem alcançar muito mais. E eu sempre sonhei em ser a melhor do mundo para poder mudar essa história. A minha infância eu tive várias dificuldades, realmente, porque eu sou de uma família de 12 irmãos, onde o meu pai era faxineiro e a minha mãe empregada doméstica. Então, a gente tinha muita boca e pouca comida, porque quase não tinha muito dinheiro para ajudar. E eu ajudava a minha família buscando o que sobrava da merenda da escola para completar o almoço ou o jantar em casa. Durante a minha infância, eu passei por várias situações não tão agradáveis, eu sofri muito bullying, em especial de uma menina muito maior do que eu. Ela tinha cerca de 14 anos e eu tinha 7. Quando eu entrei, estava muito próximo, porque eu só enxergava vulto, então eu ria muito rápido. Então eu descobri que eu podia ser atleta. E aí eu corri.
A conquista que a gente teve, para mim, foi o fato de ter, um dia antes de ter caído nos 400 metros na Paralimpíada de Londres e nos 100 metros ter conquistado a medalha de ouro com recorde mundial.
E nessa prova, eu consegui ser reconhecida mundialmente como a atleta cega mais rápida do mundo. E o meu sonho de criança valeu. Nos momentos difíceis, a minha família e os meus amigos foram fundamentais. Eu sempre imagino que eu gosto de alegrar as pessoas e cada vez que eu conquisto, eu sei que a realidade de alguém eu posso ajudar. Eu gosto muito de ajudar e poder fazer alguma coisa pelas pessoas. O meu guia faz parte do meu time. Para mim, o atletismo não é um esporte individual, é um esporte em equipe. Sou eu, o Guilherme e eu e o resto.
Nós treinamos juntos todos os dias, de segunda a sábado. Preparamos aproximadamente 5 horas a cada dia. É treino, é alimentação, isso aí é fundamental para o atleta. E como ela não pode fazer isso sozinha, a gente está sempre junto, eu sou os olhos dela.
Porque algumas pessoas têm olhos verdes, azuis, castanhos, pretos. O meu se chama Guilherme. É original. Em outubro, em Doha, nós vamos competir no Campeonato Mundial. E desejamos muito superar as nossas marcas, conquistar medalhas e conhecer pessoas, ter muita torcida, fazer muita festa, nos divertir muito com esse povo que é tão querido do Catar. Esse campeonato mundial é especialmente importante porque vai acontecer no Catar, no Oriente Médio, que é um local que ainda não existe tanto a prática do paradispor. Eu creio que depois dele haverão novos atletas, surgirão novos atletas e poderemos chegar a lugares que outrora não chegamos. É um privilégio poder participar dele e realmente que esse Mundial deixe um legado interessante para o próprio Catar e para o próprio Oriente Médio. Realizem, o meu conselho para a próxima geração de atletas seria que você é do tamanho do teu sonho. Então, que você realize os seus sonhos e não deixe para seus filhos, netos, amigos, vizinhos, amigos, inimigos. Seja você o protagonista da sua história. E não existe sonho impossível, nem grande demais se você é capaz de sonhar. Venha comigo na minha incrível jornada em Doha em outubro.
One of the there are so many things that I think that we learn from that story. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is the way that all of our different identities and experiences intersect. So you could hear in that story how she's talking about her identity as a blind person, how she's talking about her identity as an athlete. We can hear cultural references throughout her speech, her home culture, and then also she was about to compete in a very different culture. All of the different identities that we and our students bring into the classroom matter and intersect and inform each other. Yesterday, we talked about the power of advocacy. Today, I want to share that representation is both inclusion and advocacy. So being really intentional about who and how people and cultures are included in your classroom is an act of both inclusion and advocacy, and especially whose stories are celebrated. So as we're closing out this series, my question to you is, how will you celebrate more complete and complicated stories in your classrooms and communities? How will you work toward a more inclusive and vibrant world? To get us thinking in this direction, I have a series of thought questions for us. This comes from some work I've done with my colleague at Mizzou Academy, Jill Klingon. So the questions to think about as we go out and live out this work are: whom do we speak for? What issues do we speak on? Who is included and who is missing from your curriculum? Remember, we started this whole series with an emphasis on belonging. Whose stories are centered and celebrated in your communities? We've spent a lot of time on that this evening. Whose voices and perspectives do you still need to hear? So we are all works in progress as educators, as human beings. Our classrooms too will always be works in progress. So there is always more to learn and more that we can improve on. And thank goodness that our lives very interesting. I want to recap where we've been this week so that you can set a very specific action goal for next week. So this week, we've talked about the importance of belonging, inclusion, psychological safety, disability, and we've unpacked that in different ways, people first language, the power of high expectations, and I would add and love. Tonight, we talked about accommodations, representation, neurodiversity. All week, we've talked about strengths-based approaches. And then last night, we learned more about the ABCs of behavior. That's antecedent, behavior, and consequences. So as you look over this list, my goodness, we've covered a lot of ground this week in just 3 evenings. What I want you to do is I want you to choose one concept, and I want you to write down one way you will commit to this concept in your work starting next week, starting on Monday. So as you think back through night 1, 2, and then tonight, what's one thing you want to implement in your classrooms on Monday? Maybe you want to try the ABCs of behavior with one specific student. Maybe you want to increase representation in your classroom and you're going to pick out a scholar or a scientist or an athlete that you want to teach your students about. Maybe you want to teach your students about people first language and how we talk and think about disabilities. Maybe this evening when I was going through the accommodations and modifications, it gave you ideas for new kinds of supports for a specific student who's struggling, and you want to try one of those next week. As we close things out, you know, I always like to close with a looking ahead, and this is our last session for this particular series. So where do we go from here? What I hope we do is I hope we reach that action goal. Whatever you just wrote down, I hope we implement it on Monday. And maybe it's going to work really well, and that's awesome. And then we can set another goal. Or maybe it's not going to work just yet. And we're going to have to continue to tweak and iterate that goal. And that's okay too, until it does work. And then we get to set another, and then we get to keep going. So I believe in my work in schools that we can change the world through courage and connection. And I believe there's no better place to start than in our classrooms. This week, it's been just a true delight to explore with you how educators can contribute to disability rights. Disability rights is a global social movement to expand access, rights, and opportunities to members of the disability community, including kids in our classrooms today. And so as we close things out, I want to thank you for all you do in small ways and big ways to further disability rights, and for all the work that I know you'll continue to do in your classrooms and in your communities.